Hello, I'm Edward October. Over the years, I've narrated more ghost stories, horror shows, and creepypastas than I can count. And yet, the crimes discussed on our true crime podcast managed to scare the shit out of me. This program is not suitable for children or the faint of heart. If you are such a person, go ahead and switch off this podcast. Listen to something else. Are you still with us? Well, we've warned you.
Hey, Jen.
Cam, how's it going?
Woo, that was a happy welcome.
It was. It's
I was not prepared for that. It is summer. Living my best life, doing nothing. I love it.
Well, you're watching TV. That's something, right?
I am watching TV and playing solitaire and doing one little chore a day.
There you go.
So there you go. Well, I have a case for you today, my friend.
All right. What's it? Give it to me.
It's, here we go. You ready?
Yep.
Former Chief Dauphin County Detective Thomas Brennan's phone rings between 3 and 4 a.m. from a responding officer requesting assistance on a crime scene. When the detective arrives, he notices a car pulled right up close to a ditch. Now, Brennen, who received training at the FBI Behavioral Science Unit during his tenure with the state police, knew immediately what he was dealing with when he arrived on the Conrail crime scene. Conrail is the train system, by the way. After Brennen asked the officers for details, the officer explains that a train security guard official had stumbled upon a man attacking a woman. The man was startled and he ran off. Thankfully, the victim was injured but alive, so he called for police and waited with her until help would arrive. Detective Brennan noted that the vehicle's trunk was open and inside was what many would call a kill kit, such as rope, duct tape, the things that help somebody kill or otherwise incapacitate somebody. Outside the car on the ground were plastic mats, sort of like floorboard mats that you have on the inside of your car. Now, seemingly, these were used to cover the ground inside the ditch. It's now clear to the detective that this man had planned to kill his victim, put her in the ditch, and drive away. What was also clear to the detective was that this was not this man's first time killing someone. He had done it before, and he knew what he was doing. The victim, Clara, was sent to the hospital and would report to authorities that the man had raped and sodomized her. Now, she would recount to police about the events of the evening. She tells officers that she was hanging out in a bar in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, when a man offered to give her a ride home. Clara took the man up on the ride, but told him that she wanted his friend along for the journey. All three people got into the vehicle and they headed home, but soon the man pulled over and made his friend exit the car. The other man then went and drove as if he was going to take Clara home, but instead he found a dark, vacant lot near the railroad tracks. He pulled over, where he proceeded to tie up and beat Clara before violently raping her. Now, strangely, and this is a detail that Clara would recall, the man would occasionally take a break for a beer and a cigarette. But as he did this, he would detail just what he had planned to do to her next. That is sadistic, let me tell you.
It's horrible.
He then raped her yet again. He attempted to drag her to that hole, but before he could get her to that ditch, headlights caught his face and he ran away, leaving his victim injured but alive. These were the lights of the security guard who just happened about the gruesome scene. Conrail security guard's attention is drawn to the bound and gagged victim squirming for help in the dirt near the burial hole. The hole had already been dug by the killer, and he was simply waiting for the victim's body to be placed inside, making it her gravesite. The car would be traced back to a man by the name of Joseph Miller from Steelton, Pennsylvania. Police caught up to Joe, who, of course he was, hiding at a relative's house. Police capture Joe, but he manages to break from their grip and attempts to make an escape. As police recapture him, they actually caught him. He was scaling a building trying to get to the roof. He made it to the roof, and the poor police were stuck there in a standoff for 6 hours as Joe Miller would repeatedly threaten to jump and kill himself.
Of course.
6 hours. Finally, Joe agreed to come down, and he turned himself into police. Joe Miller was arrested and brought into the Susquehanna Township Police Department. Initially, Joe Miller did not want to talk. He did not want to give up the secrets he had been keeping for all these years. Detective Brennan knew that Miller had more to tell, and so he's not surprised when he received a call from the Dauphin County Prison informing him that, hey, guess what? Joe Miller wants to speak with you. Of course he does. When the detective arrived, Joe begged him to get out of the jail. He missed his kids, Jen. He missed them so deeply, and he just wanted to see them.
Probably shouldn't have, done what he did.
Detective Brennan told Joe, nope, no way. I know you have killed before, and I'm not going to rest until you fess up. He was like, not going to happen. Finally, with the carefree attitude only a killer could have, Joe looked at the detective and said, if I tell you where they are, will you let me see my kids? Whew. Joe Miller tells the detective that he will take him to where he has some buried in a landfill. From the outside looking in, it seemed like Miller was living a normal life. He was married with children and working to support his family, but his younger years were anything but normal. Joseph Miller was born on September 2nd, 1964, in Steelton, Pennsylvania, where he joined 3 older brothers and a sister. From a young age, Miller struggled. He had an intellectual disability and a neurological damage, and he suffered from anterograde amnesia. I hope I said that right, which led to constant bullying from his peers. This type of amnesia is a type of memory loss that occurs when you can't form new memories. In the most extreme cases, this means you permanently lose your ability to learn or retain any new information. On its own, this type of memory loss is rare. The more common amnesia is when you lose your past memories. That's the one we usually hear about, rather than the ones that you can't make new memories.
The whole soap opera. Don't know who I am. Yeah.
I don't know who I am. Miller also spoke with the lisp, and this was because of a childhood accident. And I gotta say, we've all done this. He was jumping from the couch, couches, jumping couch to couch, and then on the ground. Well, he missed the landing, and it caused permanent damage to his mouth, meaning he would be stuck with that lisp. He was often sent to school unbathed and in dirty clothes. All of this, of course, leads to what? Relentless bullying. Because of all this bullying, Joseph Miller dropped out of school just after, you ready? 4th grade.
Yeah.
The home in which Miller grew up in was not a loving one, to say the least. A judge would describe it as, quote, a den of incestual sexual abuse. At one of his trials, his sister took the stand and testified that she had been sexually abused by their father for 2 years. At just 15 years old, she became pregnant by her father with a child who would be Miller's own sister and his niece. When his sister told their mother what had been going on, she said her mother attacked her with a kitchen knife, causing her to run away at 15 years old, leaving 5-year-old Joseph behind. Their father, Joseph, also named Joseph, would never be charged with child rape or child abuse. In a later trial, the daughter, now grown, would take the stand and claim that their father, 3 brothers, 2 uncles, and a half-brother regularly sexually abused other members of the family, including Joe Miller. Now, it's about this time that Joe began stealing and drinking alcohol, which his older brother and father influenced. Court documents indicate that his father initiated his exposure to alcohol at the age of 6 years old. This set the stage for a habitual daily consumption that commenced as early as 19. At times, he got drunk before breakfast. In addition to alcohol, he began experimenting with marijuana and cocaine, and at one point suffered a pill overdose. This is all around the age of 19. Miller would dive into a series of criminal activities, and this would include arson, theft, assault, and even engaged in armed confrontations with law enforcement. All because of this, he was sent to juvenile detention, or juvenile home. After Miller endured a vicious attack by a group of teenagers at the age of 12, Miller went home, grabbed a shotgun, and set out to confront his attackers. As he roamed the town, discharging the firearm while searching for the teens who assaulted him, Officer J. Michael Sheldon of Steelton responded to the scene and confronted Joseph Miller. Sheldon drew his weapon on Miller, who ignored the officer's orders to drop the gun. In an attempt to defuse the situation, Sheldon fired a warning shot into the air, startling Miller, who then let go of the weapon. Reflecting back on the encounter, Officer Sheldon admitted, quote, "I should have killed him. I should have just pulled the trigger. I should have killed him. Shoot the guy. He's got a gun," was running through my mind. But I also thought, he's a kid. He's 12 years old. Then he went on to say, would those people be alive if I had done what I was trained to do? A little interesting side note. Officer Sheldon is no longer a police officer. Instead, he practices law. Thought that was interesting.
He's a lawyer now.
Mm-hmm.
Awesome.
So still in that field, but
Different side of it.
After Joseph Miller was taken into custody for this event, he was sent to a juvenile facility where he was subjected to sexual attacks and beatings by fellow inmates. The officials in charge simply overlooked the attacks, and this would cause Miller to develop post-traumatic stress disorder. Released from the juvenile facility in the early 1980s, Miller quickly returned to criminal activities and drug use. His downward spiral included a brush with death from a severe drug overdose and multiple arrests for offenses ranging from theft and assault to arson and illegal possession of firearms. By 1984, Miller departed Steelton for Harrisburg, where he secured housing and entered into a marriage. The couple would have 3 children between 1985 and 1993. Because of his very limited education, he would work mostly as a laborer and work pretty much whenever he could find work, which meant it was not consistent. A previous employer disclosed that he terminated Miller's employment due to suspicions of him breaking into a residence that they were both involved in renovating. So they, came together and they were going to rehab this house. The homeowner, an elderly widow, recounted seeing a figure brandishing a knife at her bedside. Of course, Miller denied it, and he made some really fantastic pleas for reinstatement. However, the employer reluctantly agreed to give him one other opportunity. But you know how that goes, Jen. Shortly thereafter, Miller set fire to a garage where the employer stored equipment. His wife was expecting their 3rd child when authorities apprehended him. And it's important, and here's another little side note. Following his convictions from all this, his wife initiated divorce proceedings and moved in with one of his brothers.
Yeah.
Joe, it's got a lot going on there.
Probably needed help.
On August 12, 1992, Miller, with police in tow, would take authorities to the landfill as promised. Every police specialist was there. They were excited to bring some closure to the case of these 2 missing women. Once on site, Miller is walked to the location and he points to an area that is covered by some wood and stated that one body could be found there. Miller then took a detective to another area nearby and said that another body could be found in that location. With a helicopter in the air, the dig started, which would last for hours, and they recovered nothing. Yeah. Joe Miller then starts laughing as if he pulled the greatest heist ever on the officers.
Bastard.
When Detective Brennan asked him why he was laughing, Miller said, "All that stuff I said earlier, it's not the truth." Furious, Detective Brennan threw him in the back of the squad car and got ready to take Miller back to jail. But before they could fully depart, an officer approached the car and informed the detective that they had found what they believed was a human femur. The skeletons of Stephanie McDuffie and Selena Franklin were recovered from the Swatara Township landfill back on that chilly August morning in 1982. It was on May 16, 1987, that 18-year-old Selena Franklin went missing after friends last saw her with a man named Joey, who gave the friends a ride. At the time, Joe Miller is questioned, but claims he dropped Franklin off safely and had never seen her again. When a woman's necklace is found in his car, Miller's wife claimed it was hers. Franklin was a sex worker at the time. 23-year-old Stephanie McDuffie, who was 8 months pregnant, did not return home on November 6, 1989. Her mother reported her missing. Police take the report, but nothing seems to come from it, nor does Stephanie show up. Just like Franklin, McDuffie was a sex worker. Joe Miller admitted to bludgeoning to death both of these women, following, he said sex, but really it was rape.
That's always rape.
Convinced that Joseph Miller may have been responsible for more than just these 2 known homicides, law enforcement officials executed a search warrant at his residence and wanted to validate their suspicions. Among the items seized were a small, human-like figurines positioned above a door frame. These little figurines, they're like 5 inches tall. I think they were described sort of as like African figurines. I wouldn't know if they're truly African figurines, but they're people. They're little people figurines,
You mean that
right?
they're like the warrior icon?
Kind of, yeah.
type things?
But they're homemade. You can tell that they're homemade, right?
Right. So like
Kind of-
folk.
Yeah, kind of.
Yeah.
So above the door jamb, I made that clear. Above the door jamb, there were 7 little figures up on the very top. So this discovery led the investigators to speculate whether each figure symbolized a victim. But they would have to wait and see if they were correct. They're correct. Trying to tie Miller to other cases, detectives take a long look at some female sex workers who had been raped, sodomized, and murdered in and around the area. 2 cases piqued the detective's interest immediately. One case involved a Harrisburg woman who had survived, and another involved a woman who had been murdered, her body discovered wrapped inside a rug. Once again, Detective Brennan took a shot at trying to get some information. It was during this conversation that the detective would learn just how much Miller loved talking about his crimes. While Miller was talking about committing these crimes, he was getting physically excited. The thought of it, for him, was exhilarating. Quote, "You could see the veins on his neck pumping," the detective told Patriot News in 2000, describing how Miller would relive his murders while recounting the attacks to interrogators. The detective went on to say, "It was almost like he was working out in the gym. The vein was pumping so hard on his face."
Mm-hmm. He was getting off on it. That's why. Reliving it.
So during his appearance on the TV show Shattered, available on Amazon, the detective recalled how he leaned over to whisper to Miller. Now, normally I wouldn't keep this in here, but this just goes to the demented kind of person he is. So the detective leans over to him and says, quote, "You're fucking enjoying this and your skivvies are getting sticky, aren't they?" The detective then added, "I know you did this." Miller responded, "Oh, yes, I did. I thought she was dead."
So as you all know by now, I'm a big fan of sleep cream. For years, I've had problems sleeping, and nothing has helped me like this topical cream has. And I know for a fact that it works. Let me tell you, since our family vacation had to be canceled this year, my husband and I just snuck away on a spur-of-the-moment weekend getaway, and I totally forgot to pack my bottle of sleep cream. And it was horrible. The first night, I tossed and turned. Just horrible. But I did end up getting some over-the-counter sleepy stuff to use. But I woke up with cloudy brain, and I hate having cloudy brain.
It's the worst.
It lasts until like noon. I hate it.
You know, I love my sleep cream too. I love that instead of using sedatives or harmful additives, sleep cream's key ingredient is CBD plus organic oils and plant extracts. The light scent of lavender helps calm my nerves. I absolutely love that smell. I just put a little bit on my neck, and before you know it, I start getting sleepy.
Sleep cream doesn't contain THC, so it won't cause a high or trigger a failed drug test. The CBD reacts to your skin's nerve receptors rather than going into the bloodstream, and it helps your mind and body relax so you can have a restful night's sleep. So if you're not sleeping 7 to 8 hours a night, you gotta go to sleepcream.com and try the original and finest CBD sleep topical on the market today.
If you don't experience better sleep, they will refund your money. So, what do you have to lose except another night of amazing rest? Order your bottle at SleepCream, that's CREME.com.
Use code OTC Podcast, that's all one word, when you go to checkout, and you can save $20 on your first order.
No, seriously, go now. Go and order your bottle at SleepCream, CREME.com. Detective Brennan was referencing the June 30th, 1992 attack on that Harrisburg sex worker woman who was raped, forced to perform sex acts, and then stabbed in the head with a screwdriver more than 25 times, and then was shot for good measure. She was left for dead in Perry County. However, this woman did something Miller did not expect. She lived. The detective wanted more information about the body that was recovered inside that rug. Miller claimed responsibility for her death as well. This was regarding the discovery of Kathy Novena Schink, also known as Phoenix Bell, who was found on February 27, 1990, at a road at a roadside dump in Penn Township in Perry County. The Harrisburg woman had been run over by a car several times. Joe Miller would tell the detective that when she tried to get away, he ran her over with his car several times until he was sure she was dead. He then wrapped her in a rug and tossed her to the side of the road like a piece of trash. So at this point, talking to the detective, Miller has admitted to killing 3 women and attacking 2 others who luckily survived. But Detective Brennan cannot get those 7 figurines on the top of that door frame out of his mind, and he's determined to figure out the names of the final 2 victims. Takes a bit more time, but a dogged detective is going to get what they want. Soon, the murder of Jeanette Thomas comes to light. 25-year-old Jeanette Thomas went missing on January 11th, 1990. Thomas was last seen leaving an Allison Hill bar with the man and was never seen again. Her body would be discovered in a Swatara Township landfill. The man was described to police, and the description looked an awful lot like, guess who? Joe Miller. But Jen, there's just one little catch about this, in this murder. The man who committed this crime admitted his part in the murder, and he was actually serving time for this murder. The man was 31-year-old William Kelly, and he confessed to it, and he was sentenced to 10 to 20 years in prison. But you see, the thing is, Jen, William was also intellectually disabled, and
False.
As we've seen in past cases, sometimes people admit to a crime simply thinking they'll get out of it later, or that they were not provided with adequate support when they were being interrogated, such as a lawyer or an adult if you're a child. When DNA evidence was tested, wouldn't you know it? Yep, that DNA evidence did not belong to William Kelly, but instead belonged to Joe Miller. Thankfully, William was released when Joe Miller admitted that he was actually the person who had killed Jeanette Thomas. During the initial trial, Camp Hill psychologist Stanley E. Schneider provided testimony about Joseph Miller's background and mental state. Schneider's evaluation revealed a complex mix of factors, including intellectual and developmental disabilities, emotional challenges, and learning disabilities. He highlighted Miller's upbringing as, quote, a violent, abusive, alcoholic home. The doctor testified that all these factors contributed to Miller's actions. The defense wanted the court to consider Miller's mental state, his IQ, and background when weighing the charges against him. By the way, Miller's IQ was tested during the trial, registering at 56, which is defined as a mild intellectual disability. But his IQ had been tested earlier, and it was as high as 81, which is borderline intellectual disability. Now, what would make all the difference in this case is just one thing, or should I say one person? Who better to describe what Joe Miller was capable of than someone who survived his wrath? That's right. Clara, the woman who was found by the train security guard, would take the stand and tell jurors about the brutal attack courtesy of Joe Miller. Clara, after all, was the reason that Joe Miller was ever apprehended. On March 25, 1993, Miller was found guilty of the murders of Selena Franklin and Stephanie McDuffie, in addition to the abduction and sexual assault of Clara Johnson. These convictions led to, that's right, the death sentence. Now, Kathy Shink's murder conviction over in Perry County would earn Miller yet another murder conviction and yet another death sentence. So right now, he's looking at 4 death sentences. However, Joseph Miller's sentence would change in 2002. Miller's mental state took center stage in his appeals after he received the death penalty. In 2002, the U.S. Supreme Court made a landmark ruling stating that individuals with intellectual disabilities could not be subjected to execution, deeming it cruel and unusual punishment. Instead, Miller received 3 life sentences for his crimes. This leaves just one victim of Miller's left for police to identify. 26-year-old Kellyanne Ward was reported missing by family members on February 11, 1986. In 1997, a construction crew was working behind the Harrisburg East Mall, and while they were digging up dirt, human bones came to the surface. These bones would remain in custody without a name attached to them all the way into the spring of 2014. That's a lot. That's a lot of years.
It's very long period.
Ward's family was contacted and asked to submit some DNA. and within weeks, investigators got confirmation that the remains belonged to Kelly Ann Ward. Now, the parallels between Miller's known homicides and the case of Kelly Ward are chillingly striking. Ward's skeletal remains were discovered near a location where Miller had previously discarded 2 other bodies. Furthermore, Ward fit the profile of victims that Miller typically targeted, young, Black individuals living on the fringes of society in Harrisburg. They were all sex workers. It's now time for the detective to go have another little chat with Joe Miller. However, this time it seems that Miller's demeanor has shifted significantly. Unlike before, he was very cooperative. Now, he remains tight-lipped. He is offering neither cooperation nor confession. Instead, he responded to questions about Ward with laughter, citing his inability to recall due to being in, quote, a dark place and heavily under the influence of drugs at the time. When directly asked about any involvement in the disappearance and murder of Kelly Ann Ward, Miller shockingly responded, "I'm not the only serial killer that was killing girls." So the detective has one more little trick up his sleeve. He has a photograph of a pipe, and he shows it like a pipe, not a smoking pipe, but like a metal pipe. And he shows it to Miller, who seems to almost light up. Miller then kind of laughed and said, the pipe he used on her was much smaller. Finally, Miller described picking Kelly Ann up from a city restaurant, driving her to that same landfill, engaging in sexual activity, and ultimately killing her with that pipe, then covering her body with tires and shingles. That's it. Investigators now have what they needed to tie Miller to the death of Ward. The affidavit of probable cause highlights resemblances in the physical evidence discovered at the prior crime scenes of Joseph Miller's 4 other homicide victims, alongside incriminating statements made by Miller to investigators, which would seal the deal for the serial killer. In April of 2016, Miller confessed on tape to the killings of Ward and Jeanette Thomas. In his testimony, he expressed remorse to the victims' families and expressed a desire to plead guilty, influenced by conversations he had had with the relatives of the deceased women. Based on this confession, on June 24, 2016, he was convicted of the murders and received 2 additional life sentences. On Wednesday, April 13, 2016, Dauphin County District Attorney Ed Marsico declared during a press conference that charges were being pressed against convicted serial killer Joseph Miller for the murder of Kelly Ward and Jeanette Thomas. Investigators believe that Kelly Ann Ward was Miller's first victim, but was the last to be discovered. When Joe Miller was asked by Detective Brennan why he targeted Black sex workers, he replied with, quote, "If the first one would have been a white debutante, you guys would have been all over my ass," end quote.
That's true.
So, Jen, we've discussed it many times before on the podcast, and I'm sure, sadly, we will discuss it many more times. Is it nature or nurture that makes a killer? Some perceive Joe Miller as a mentally challenged individual shaped by parental abuse and relentless bullying, whose fury is a manifestation of his environment, upbringing, and post-traumatic stress, while others are not so kind, claiming that Miller's ability to maintain a seemingly normal family life, including his wife and his children, all while carrying out rape and murder of potentially 5 women, along with the brutal assaults on the 2 that survived, was a man who was acutely aware of what he was doing. After all, remember, he traveled with a kill kit and picked his victims that he believed society would never miss. The quote that Detective Brennan shared with Patriot News investigative reporter Pete Shellham in 2000 offers a chilling insight into Joseph Miller's psyche. According to the detective, quote, "What our society has to learn is that there are individuals out there who commit these kinds of crimes for no other reason than they like it. They enjoy seeing the fear that they place in the victim and the control that they hold over the victim. And finally, they really enjoy the godlike feeling of taking a life." And that would perfectly sum up Mr. Joseph Miller.
That whole nature and nurture will always get me. I don't think I'll ever be able to, I'm not smart enough to make a definitive answer, but it takes all kinds, right? I mean, you have people that weren't abused, had perfectly good childhoods, and they murder.
That's exactly what I was going to say.
Right. So
they don't murder. Or they have that same sort of abuse and they don't grow up and murder.
Right.
Goes both ways.
Right, exactly. Yeah.
Mr. Miller is alive and well. I just checked on him this morning.
No, I looked him up. Prison has not done him any
favors.
Yeah.
Nope.
He looks rough.
And I love that he's at the prison's name is Camp Hill, which I think it's probably far from a camp, but he's 59 years old.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, yeah.
He
just frightening. And so, there was a lot of debate about his intellectual disability and how that went and not getting a death sentence, I guess, or not being handed a death sentence. But you do, again, I mentioned, he carries the kill kit. So this is all premeditated. He also knows what to do with them. He knows what kind of victims will be likely to not be as missed as the quote unquote white debutante that he said. So I think all of that goes into play. He knew what he was doing, is all I got to say about that.
I agree. And then I looked to see what the cutoff was to the death penalty, right? What the mental IQ is, and it's 70. But some states, I think, was it Florida? Let me see here. There was a big lawsuit because, it was Florida. They had a decision whether or not to execute Freddie Lee Hall, who was eligible for execution because his score was 71, with the cutoff is 70. Yeah, and they go on to say that it's just not the mental capability. There's also other things. Commonly suffer from multidimensional mental problems. The ruling will affect other states with similar cutoffs, such as Kentucky, Virginia, and Alabama. So, yeah.
I do think there was somebody that was on death row. And I wholeheartedly believe certain people should be on death row and certain people shouldn't. So just about a year ago, we had a gentleman who was put to death, and they kept saying that he shouldn't be put to death because of his extremely low IQ. And let me just say, when I watched the interview with him, he had no idea what he was doing. He didn't know why he was there. He didn't understand what was upcoming in just the next couple of hours. Genuinely can tell.
Right.
He should not have been put to death. But then I guess that also goes back, boy, am I a Libra or what? I can justify anything. Goes back to the fact that he might not know what's going on about being put to death, but yet he killed somebody. So you go to that too,
And remember the Chain of Rocks murders with Julie and Robin Carey? Wasn't that person, wasn't he not given the death penalty? Am I remembering that wrong?
I believe so. He was and then was taken off. But there's a whole lot going on there too, let me tell you.
Oh, yeah.
So if you go down that rabbit hole, for sure.
Yeah. No, I agree. I mean, you just can't you have to look at the whole thing. Like, he might have had an IQ of 56. He also, maybe like me, doesn't test well.
Well, I was kind of thinking it was a little remarkable that the one during his trial, he was tested lower than the one that he had taken previously.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Because I'm sure you can fake it.
I would think so. Which even goes back to tell you that he's smarter.
Exactly. But there needs to be you can't just do the cutoff of mental disability. You have to look at the whole picture. As with everything. You just can't. Not everything's black and white.
Jen and I are both Libras, and I swoosh back and forth all the time. And I've said this a million times. I wholeheartedly believe some people will never be fixed. I'd look upon it to the victim's family on how they would choose. Would you feel better if this person was taken out of this world? Others prefer them to suffer prison's terrible suffrage, this goes back to Ariel Castro, who was the man in Ohio that abducted those 3 girls and kept them for years. He didn't make it 30 days in prison before he completed suicide, right? And he kept those girls in captivity for years, decades. And so it's sometimes I think that is worse than death, because death, you're done. I remember when Susan Smith killed her kids, and she was in sentencing part, and this is when I was working at Booksource, and one of the guys I was talking to, I'm like, she deserves to be executed. I mean, she purposefully murdered her children because she wanted a man, and that man didn't want kids. I mean, that's just the lowest to me. I mean, just like Diane Downs, same thing.
Seriously, I just think it's disgusting. And the guy that I was speaking to said, I think she deserves to be in a small cell with pictures of her kids everywhere. So she's reminded every day of why she's in there. And I'm like, you know what? That's not a bad...
Chris Watts.
Yeah.
Chris Watts. But Chris Watts seemingly was normal, quote unquote.
Well, so was Susan Smith. You know?
Speaking of which, we just had something very similar to Susan Smith happen here in St. Louis.
But she didn't kill for a man, right? You want to go ahead and tell her what it is, or tell everyone?
So we know that we know of yet, because of course the details aren't out there. So I believe she was 36 and she's local here. Took out her 2-year-old son and tried to quote unquote sacrifice him.
She drowned him.
And when that failed, then she took him and drowned him at a resort lake, the Fountain. Whatever. All the time, her 9-year-old daughter's in the car and shot her daughter and then drove to the police station to turn herself in. And that happened about a week ago.
Right.
I'm thinking it was religious delusions,
Well, on her Facebook page, she had many quotes of the Bible, and then she turned her Facebook profile picture to black. And then the last thing I think she put was, "They've tricked me."
Yeah.
And
definitely some mental issues going on there.
And
but we don't know. We'll keep you updated on that. Like I said, that just happened.
Yep. But thus we heard she claimed it was a sacrifice. Terrible.
Awful. Well, Jen, that's it for today. I guess we will see you next Wednesday.
Yep.
Same time.
We'll be here.
Same channel. Right here.
We'll be here. You be here too.
Central Standard
We'll meet you.
Time. Yep. That's right. And until then, remember, lock your doors.
Keep passing by those open windows.
Bye-bye.
Love ya.
Today's episode was researched and written by me, Cam. For more information about this episode, as well as all the sources I used, please check out our show notes or the podcast website at ourtruecrimepodcast.com. Our True Crime Podcast is developed and created by hosts Jen and Cam. Original music and audio mix of all our True Crime Podcast episodes is courtesy of Nico Vertesi from We Talk of Dreams. Listener discretion is provided by Edward October from October Pod VHS. Our True Crime Podcast is executive produced by Nico Vertesi and Dick Vane. Make sure to like and subscribe to Our True Crime Podcast wherever you listen to your podcast. We can be reached on Instagram and Facebook at Our True Crime Podcast or on Twitter at Our True Crime Pod. You can email us at ourtruecrimepodcast@gmail.com. If you really like the show, make sure to check out our Patreon at Our True Crime Podcast. Our True Crime Podcast is an OTC production.